brain dopamine and serotonin vesicular transport disease and its treatment by Gibson Zurita Beto. Introduction. Known disorders of biogenic neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin involve the effect in 9 signs and one transporter. Affect person present in early childhood with symptoms referring to the affect neurotransmitter. And the disorders are diagnosed by measurement of neurotransmitter breakdown products in the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSI.
Our brains are complex webs of chemicals and nerves. Inside the brain, nerve cells called neurons are constantly communicating with each other to shape how we think, feel, and act. Let's have a closer look at these nerve cells. These are the ends of two neurons. The one on the right sends a message, the one on the left receives it. At first they look connected, but they're actually separated by a tiny space called the synapse. This is where messages are relayed. What we'll see next is how we normally experience pleasure. The sending neuron contains dopamine, the brain's pleasure chemical. When something good happens to us, this feel-good chemical is released into the synapse, where it connects with receptors. There, dopamine activates the receiving neuron, which in turn conveys the message onto the next neuron, creating a chain reaction that produces pleasure. After the message is sent, dopamine is recycled by transporters to be reused. This conversation repeats itself again and again, and gives us the feeling of pleasure and reward.
Neurotransmitter deficiencies. Deficiencies in dopamine result in movement disorder. Deficiency norepinephrine or epinephrine cause autonomic dysfunction, and serotonin deficiency leads to sleep and psychiatric disturbance.
The biggest clue that the serotonin system is involved in OCD is this preferential efficacy of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But finding an actual evidence that there's an imbalance of serotonin or an abnormality in the serotonin system has been elusive.
Study overviews. We describe members of a family with symptoms of deficiency in dopamine, dystonia, Parkinsonism, and ocularity, crisis, serotonin, sleep and mood disturbance, and epinephrine and norepinephrine, diaphoresis, temperature instability, ptosis, and postural hypotension, with no demonstrable deficiency of neurotransmitters in the CSF.
A chemical known as dopamine is released from an area of the brain called the substantia nigra. neurotransmitter is released by neurons onto adjacent cells and into a synapse, sending a signal that enables smooth, coordinated muscle movement. In Parkinson's disease, dopamine release by the substantia nigra is diminished. In response, the adjacent areas of the thalamus and globus pallidus interna become overactive, creating a resultant tremor.
Genome investigation revealed a mutation in the gene encoding VMAT2 that compromises transport of biogenic amines into synaptic vesicles, resulting in impairment of their synaptic transmission without detectable reduction in their amount.
The brain contains 100 billion cells, neurons, and they make 100 trillion connections or synapses. And each of the neurons release chemical substances called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are the legal tender of the brain. That's how these cells communicate with each other.
As the neurotransmitters flow through the brain like a river, sending a steady stream of information between the brain's emotional and thinking regions. Just a few milligrams of an antidepressant like Prozac, Zoloft, or Paxil can quickly and radically affect one of them, the mood-influencing chemical serotonin. In the synaptic gap between the neurons, where serotonin delivers messages from one cell to another, sit a series of molecules that work like locks on a canal, regulating the flow of serotonin, determining its rise and fall. In the depressed brain, serotonin is often at low ebb. An antidepressant can plug the entry to some of the molecular locks, forcing serotonin levels to rise in the open spaces between the cells, a change that occurs throughout the brain, especially in the brain's prefrontal cortex.
And the fact that it occurs in the prefrontal cortex, I think, is very intriguing, since this is the very area that people would have guessed would be a critical area in being able to regulate your mood, for the brain to be able to get itself back on track.
Higher levels of serotonin stimulate a cascade of reactions that bring the brain back into balance. Within weeks, the symptoms of depression mysteriously lift.
What we really want to understand is that last step, that last bit, that change in the wiring, so that the I'm no good changes to maybe things are not so bad. And that is going to take an enormous amount of progress in neuroscience. But when we understand that, we're going to understand very, very important things about what it means to be human, how things go wrong, and how things can go right.
Conclusion: treatment with levodopa was associated with worsening, whereas treatment with direct dopamine agonist was followed by immediate ambulation, near complete correction of the movement disorders and resumption of development. Thanks for your attention.